Hi, welcome to Pyrography Made Easy. I'm Brenda. In this tutorial episode, I am going to show you how to create this easy moonlit tree scene. The artwork relies on using a little metal embossing tool. I'll put a link to a set of them in the video description. They're not very expensive. If you have a rotary tool like a Dremel, you can use that instead, but it's not necessary. Before we get going, I should warn you that this was a little bit of an experiment for me. And once I was done, I realized that my scene needed a little something in it, and it was at this point I decided to add the deer. But I highly recommend putting the deer in long before I did. Despite this, you won't have any problems doing this artwork. Well, let's get started. It's up to you if you want to draw your own moonlit scene or use my drawing. If you draw your own, I highly recommend drawing it out on paper first. This allows you to make changes and ensures the graphite doesn't get embedded in the board, which usually isn't a problem unless you're working with plywood. In the video description will be a link to my website where you can find the drawing that I did. I always start with a concept sketch to work out the general placement of the objects. Then I create a drawing that I can use as a pattern. Once the drawing is ready, I like to coat the back of it with graphite, tape it to the board graphite side down, and trace over the lines. I prefer this method versus using carbon paper because graphite erases much easier from the board. I've had carbon paper that produced super dark lines that I couldn't erase. I had to sand them off. Before you remove the pattern, always lift it up and check for missing lines. I wanted the moon to overlap onto the border frame. I'm cutting away the corner on the pattern so I can align it properly with my board. To emboss the tree, I am using these embossing tools. The video description will have a link to the set. You need to exert good force to get nice deep lines on the wood. Softer woods, like basswood, which is what I'm using, are easier to do this than harder woods like maple. As you work, emboss over all of the fine tree branches and twigs. Only emboss along the outer edges of the thicker branches and the tree trunk. When the artwork is complete, these embossed lines will be pale in color, creating the moonlit effect. As you can see, I did not emboss the owl. If you have a Dremel or other rotary tool, you can use that instead of an embossing tool. I am using Culiau's Customizer Engraver for this test piece. Now I like this because it is smaller and easier to control, and that's nice when you're doing fine work like this. It is much faster to engrave the lines using a rotary tool, but it can be done without one. I did a product review on this engraver, and I will put a link to that review in the video description. Next, I drew a 1/2-inch border line around the edges of the board. Then I used a metal straight edge and an X-Acto knife to cut along that line. I carefully avoided the moon, but I did not avoid the tree limbs that stuck out onto the border. Use a writer pen tip to burn over the pencil lines for the owl, moon, hill, and deer. As you can see, I added the deer after the artwork was pretty much done. I had a little difficulty seeing my pencil lines, so I highly recommend adding the deer at the beginning. After the trace lines are burned over, then rub a pencil eraser over the board to remove residual and embedded graphite. I am using the Vanish brand of eraser, but any eraser will work. For deeply embedded graphite, I press a kneadable eraser down into the grooves. I will put a link to both erasers in the video description. Use a skew pen tip and burn a dark line in the cut border line. Start the burn stroke at the top of the board and pull the pen tip down towards yourself. Use a light hand pressure and allow the pen tip to follow the cut line groove. Rotate the board as needed so that you are always pulling the pin tip down towards yourself. Use the shader of your choice and burn a dark band of color adjacent to the cut line. I try to angle my pen tip slightly so that the edge of it follows that cut line. Then place your pen tip on the dark band of color and pull the pen tip down towards yourself. Depending on the heat setting of your burner, it may take a couple of passes before the area has a dark, uniform color. I have the heat set on my burner just to the point to get a medium, maybe a medium dark brown color. The heat is low enough that I'm not getting overburn. The downside of this is that I do have to reburn over areas several times to build up the color. If you extended the outer edges of the tree branches onto the border, like I did, just burn right over them. Be aware that the higher the heat is, the more likely you are to lose some of the shallower embossed lines. If the color is pale, the lines can be restored fairly easily by rubbing over them with an embossing tool. Afterwards, resume burning the border with your shader. I can tell that the heat has been increased on my burner. First of all, I can see there's some smoke from the burn strokes, and the resulting burn strokes are darker. Since the heat on my burner is at a higher temperature, I'm losing some of the embossed lines. There are some other ways to restore them, and I will cover that in a different chapter. Here's how the artwork looks at this point. I'm drawing a line for the horizon where the distant trees will be. Then I'm adding vertical lines to represent the tree trunks. After the lines are in place, use a shader and burn over the vertical lines. Afterwards, start at the top of a vertical line and burn semi-horizontal lines that curve downward. The length of the line should get longer as you work your way down the tree trunk. Don't worry about the branches overlapping onto adjacent trees. The trees are just background filler. The only thing people will notice are the tree tops. Make sure to vary how tall the trees are. Also, how many trees you put into the background is completely up to you. As you can see, I burn over the branches on the moonlit tree, because this helps the shader glide over the embossed branches versus sinking down into them. As you work, make sure to carefully burn around the owl and the thicker branches on the moonlit tree. Also, avoid burning over the tree trunk. Rotate the board as necessary to make it easier on yourself when burning around the tree trunk and the larger branches. I lost some of my moonlit branches, so I'm using the tip of a sharp knife to gently scrape them back into existence. If you have a Dremel or similar tool, you can use that instead. After the small branches are restored, then I reburned over the trees in the area to darken them up. I do make an effort to avoid burning over the moonlit branches. Ignore the fact that the background is done in my artwork. Now is the time to work on the deer. Trace the deer onto the board, then use a writer pen tip and burn over the trace lines. I kept the pattern close by to help me with this because some of the lines weren't easy to see on my board. Once the trace lines are burned in, rub over the area with an eraser to remove any residual graphite. Then burn the deer to a dark color. I am mostly using a circular motion type of burn stroke, but quite truthfully, the burn stroke you use does not matter because we are not creating a specific texture. Instead, we just need to burn the deer to a dark, semi-uniform color. I switched to a larger writer pen tip to speed up the burning process, but feel free to use the pen tip of your choice. After the deer are burned in, it is time to create their cast shadows. The moon is in the upper right corner, so the cast shadows need to angle down towards the left corner. How much of an angle you give your cast shadows is completely up to you. The only important thing is to have the same angle on all of the shadows. Don't worry about making the cast shadow an exact replica of the deer. No one's going to look that closely at them. I am using a circular motion burn stroke to create the shadows. As you can see, my shadows are not uniform in color, but that doesn't mean you have to do the same thing. If you want them to be uniform in color, please do so. Burn a line that starts at the base of a tree and angles down towards the left. Make sure that the angle of the line matches the angle of the cast shadows on the deer. Also, stop burning the line before it overlaps onto a deer. Start at the top of a line and burn slightly downward curving lines. The lines should get longer as you near the base of the tree. This is the same process that we use to create the trees. Don't burn the shadows as dark as I did. My dark shadows did not look right once I was done. I used a piece of 240 grit sandpaper and rubbed over the shadows to lighten them up. Use the shader of your choice and burn over the ground. Keep the ground lighter in color than the cast shadows of the tree and the deer. I am using the flat of the shader to burn zigzags. This creates a non-uniform color. I was trying to create the vague impression of grass. Eventually, I realized that this was a silly notion because you wouldn't see the grass texture in a moonlit scene, especially at the distance that the deer and grass are from the viewer. Once I realized this, I switched to uniform strokes to create a smoother ground texture, but either way will work. In your artwork, the deer should be in place already. I already mentioned I didn't add the deer till the end of this. You have options with the deer. You can avoid burning over them, but you don't have to. You can burn right over the deer as you're working on the ground. The ground is much lighter in color than the deer, so these burn strokes won't have much, if any, impact on them. The hill the moonlit tree is on should be lighter in color than the ground the deer are on. Use the embossing tools to create very deep divots in the sky. I recommend using different sizes. The reason is that the divots will represent distant stars, so the different sizes will add a touch of realism to our sky. Rub your pen tip on the dark trees to remove excess heat. Afterwards, start burning the sky adjacent to the moon. Avoid burning over the moon. I am using either circular motion or uniform strokes as my burn method. The color of the sky should get gradually darker the further from the moon you are. I recommend using the largest shader you own to make the process go quicker. Also, don't use a high heat when burning because it is harder to keep the color smooth looking. Overlapping your burn strokes will also help smooth out the color. There are 3 other tips I can give you for getting smooth color. 1. Use a light hand pressure. A light hand pressure allows the pen tip to glide over the surface of the board, and this allows the pen tip to stay at a consistent temperature. 2. Burn with the wood grain. I'm not sure why, but it is much easier to get smooth results burning with the grain than across it. If needed, rotate the board so that you are burning with the wood grain. And 3. Pull the pen tip down towards yourself. Burning in this direction makes it easier to keep a consistent hand pressure and hand speed. I'm scraping away some of the color from the line around my moon. It was too dark and made my moon look like a coloring book moon. Burn over the small branches on the moonlit tree, but avoid the larger branches and the tree trunk. You've seen me use a number of different shaders in this video. That's because I was testing them out on this experimental project. I don't want you to think that you must use a variety of shaders for this artwork. You only need one. I'm only using a variety of them because I'm taking advantage of this situation. As you can see, I reburn over the sky several times to build up the color. I've switched to a smaller shader because the smaller size makes it easier for me to avoid the larger branches and the tree trunk. Obviously, I wasn't careful enough because I still burned over them in a couple areas. I am currently using circular motion as my main burn method, but I still use some uniform strokes. I tell you this information so that you understand what I did to create the artwork. I want to emphasize that does not mean you have to do the exact same thing. Use the burn stroke that you are comfortable with that produces the results you are after. Use a writer pen tip and burn a very loose open circular motion on the moon surface. This means that you are burning loops or circles that are large enough so that you can see the underlying wood in the center of the circle. Allow the pen tip to meander over the moon's surface as you burn. This will ensure the texture is random and that lines do not form. Darken up small areas here and there by reburning over the area. Use the same open circular motion burn stroke for this. Afterwards, burn some tiny dots onto the moon's surface. I am using a writer pen tip for this, but a ball pen tip can also be used. Vary the color and size of the dots. This is done by altering how long the pen tip is in contact with the board. The shorter the time, the smaller and lighter in color the dot will be. Lightly burn over the branches and trunk on the moonlit tree. Make sure the color of the tree is lighter in value than the sky. I am using either circular motion or uniform strokes as my burn method. The color does not need to be uniform, but I do recommend keeping the outer edges of the tree lighter in value than the center. This will help convey the moonlit effect. If needed, you can change the shape of your tree. I had finally noticed how odd mine looked, so I burned over part of the tree to slim it up and make it look better. As I finish up the tree trunk, I did make the left side of it a touch darker than the right. The reason is that the left side is furthest from the moon. Once the burning was done, I used an X-Acto knife to gently scrape away some of the color on a couple of the branches. I also restored some of the small twigs or branch ends. Of course, you can use a Dremel or other rotary tool like I am using. This is a faster method than using a knife, but it cannot make as fine or as thin of lines as the knife can. The last thing I did with the tree was use a small tipped writer nib, and I darkened up the sky around some of the tiny branches. I also made some of the tiny branches thinner. Lastly, I used a writer pen tip and burned the owl to a medium tan color. For some reason, I added two little dots to represent its eyes. This is completely unnecessary. I did reburn over the left side of the owl so that it was slightly darker than the right. Well, that is it for this video. On my website, Pyrography Made Easy, I have the written version of this tutorial along with the free pattern that you can use. My website also has a lot of other free tutorials and free patterns, and I will put a link to that in the video description. Well, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you soon.